Alright, boys and girls, so we're going to do things a little bit differently this time. Normally, I would just make a PowerPoint, record some audio over it, but instead of doing that, I'm going to use something called Screencast-O-Matic, which is going to kind of give me a little bit more mobility. I can point to things, I can pull up different slides as I want because they'll all be over here. If I wanted to drag a picture in, like this one of Mr. McDonald, and wave it around the screen, I could also do that. I probably won't, but it's just nice to know that the freedom's there. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over the 5.1 notes and the lesson that goes along with it. So as I said the last time, the best thing for you to do would be to take the notes first. After taking the notes, go back to it and listen to the lesson again to make sure you kind of get the full experience of it and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Especially if I tell you to underline something or if I tell you to put a star next to something, it would be in your best benefit to really listen to this twice. And it shouldn't take that long because there's only a few slides. All right, so let's begin. The first thing we read about as we read through this chapter is the relationship with Britain and what was going on in the colonies before what we deemed the British actions began happening. And after the British win a huge piece of land, they quickly realize they have a problem. It becomes very difficult to control all this land. So what do? Well, the first thing they do is they pass what's called the Proclamation of 1763. And you really do need to know these four things right here, the things that I'm kind of highlighting right now. The reason you need to know them is because they're extremely important to understand Britain's motivations to do it. They pass it because they want to control westward expansion, first and foremost, meaning they want to be able to control people and tell them where they can and cannot settle. The next thing they want to do is be able to avoid conflict with Native Americans. They do this because they're tired of sending troops and spending money out in the West to protect settlers who they feel like shouldn't be there in the first place. The next thing they want to do is they want to keep colonists on the eastern coast. The reason why they want to do this is because they want to create a market for British goods. What I basically mean when I say this is they want to make sure they have customers. Okay, if they keep people on the eastern coast, they guarantee people to sell to. The further you spread people out, the more other countries get involved in selling and things like that, and that's not good for business. So they want to be able to control people where they are. And then lastly, it allowed them to control that lucrative fur trade that we've always talked about. They fought for this during the French Indian War. They thought it was the best thing and the best way to make money. So what do? They want to control it as best as they can. And if they don't have settlers out in the West, they can send their people out there to be involved in the fur trade and not have to worry about other settlers and people from other countries competing with them as far as the money goes in the fur trade. The other big problem that Britain has as far as this section goes is the fact that they have a massive debt. If you remember from the last chapter that we read, the Prime Minister of England agreed that they would pay all of the fees associated with the French and Indian War. Well, as I told you then, that was untrue. What they figured they would do is just raise the colonists' taxes later. What they did not expect was the colonists to fight back when they did raise their taxes. So after the French and Indian War, they have this massive debt. And they begin looking for ways to generate, the word that we used today was revenue, right? The incoming money. So they begin looking at ways to generate some more revenue and figure out ways to make more money. And unfortunately for them, it is at the colonists' expense. This guy over here is a guy named George Grenville. He becomes the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. Okay, when he becomes the Prime Minister, he really fights against one thing, and that's smuggling. Okay, he doesn't like smuggling. He thinks smuggling is costing Britain a ton of money. In fact, he's kind of single-minded in this, where he thinks that is the biggest problem. He doesn't realize that it's spending money on colonies that aren't generating revenue. It's fighting wars across the world. He feels like it's smuggling that's really costing them the most money. So he starts trying to figure out ways to curb or stop smuggling. One of the ways he does, or he's convinced he can stop it, is by sending these cases to what we call Vice Admiralty courts, which we talked about in class already. The reason he wants to send them there is because there's no jury, as you see here. The fact that there is no jury is good for him because in the colonies, when a person is put on trial, the people in the jury would normally be a jury of his peers, meaning other colonists, and they normally would not convict people of smuggling. Well, he is unhappy with this. So what does he do? He wants to send it to a military court where he can kind of control what's going on, and he knows that people in the military, or in the Navy in particular, will convict smugglers because they're fighting against it also. Another way he tries to get them to stop smuggling is he passes something called the writs of assistance, again, which we've talked about. The writs of assistance are basically modern day search warrants. The only difference is they have a little bit more freedom than our police or officials would have today. It is basically a piece of paper that allows them to go into any building that they want to search for smuggled goods. It doesn't have to say what they're looking for. It doesn't have to have an address of what building. They basically used to just carry these things around and enter buildings at will. Today's search warrants, police would have to have an address. They'd have to go in front of a judge, convince the judge that the search warrant is actually needed and constitutional. And a police officer just couldn't enter your house to search for something and accuse you of smuggling goods today. There's a process to this that they did not have back then. All right, so the Sugar Act, that is one of the first what we call quote-unquote British acts. When we talk about this, I normally call them actions because I deem it as something that the British did to the colonists, but many people just call them acts, and again, it's kind of the same thing. What George Grenville actually did was he actually lowered the tax on imported molasses, and he thought that this would make the colonists happy. Okay, he figured it'd make them so happy that they would just say, you know what? He's a nice guy. He lowered the tax on molasses. We should really stop smuggling. But what it also allowed them to do is what he kind of tried to sneak in there was he wanted them to be able to seize goods without going to court first. So he wanted British officials to be able to go into people's houses, accuse someone of smuggling, and then not have to go to court and just take the goods. Like the example I used in one of the classes was if you bought a TV and lost the receipt and then a police officer comes to the house and says that TV's stolen, you say, no, it's not. Well, what proof do you have that it's not stolen? Well, I lost the receipt. Well, then I'm taking it with me. That's kind of what they were doing. They'd go into people's houses or go on the ships, and they would accuse people of smuggling that weren't actually smuggling. What they were actually doing was they were just stealing goods for themselves in many cases. And this upset a lot of colonists because they felt like they, in particular, were being wronged by this. They were upset for these two reasons. They believed as English citizens, okay, because again, don't forget, they were citizens of England at this point. They believe it violates their right to a secure home. The fact that a police officer or an official back then could just enter their home and search their goods and take their goods, they did not like that. Also, they believe that it violated their right until innocent until proven guilty, which if you've ever watched the show Cops or something like that, it says all people on the show are considered innocent to proven guilty. That's kind of a cornerstone of American justice today. Well, this basically said you have to prove your innocence, which hopefully none of you have ever been on trial for something before, but as you could probably imagine, it's pretty difficult to prove you are innocent to somebody that already thinks you're guilty than it is to prove your guilt when you're already considered innocent. All right, so new taxes. This one is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. This is the one that really upsets the colonists, and we're going to go over why. It's called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is an act, or a tax rather, that is placed on all printed goods. So if you bought playing cards, newspapers, books, wills, Bibles, doesn't matter what you buy. If it is basically a paper good, you had to go to the tax collector, and he would give it a rubber stamp, just like you would see today. It would have kind of the royal crest on it. He would rubber stamp it with ink, and you would say that you had paid your tax for that good. The colonists went completely insane. Again, as it says right here, they saw this as the most unfair of all the acts ever passed. And the reason they saw this way was because they believed that Parliament had directly interfered in colonial affairs by taxing them directly. That means that this is the first time Parliament ever taxed the colonies where it came out of the colonists' pocket. Normally it would just be on a good or a supply, and it would be factored into the price. But this is the first time a colonist ever had to go to the tax collector, give the tax collector money out of their own pocket to pay for a tax. And they also, this is where you kind of get that no taxation without representation. They didn't feel like they were given a voice in Parliament, and the fact that they were being taxed by a governing body where they didn't have a representative upset them very much. So they start protesting the Stamp Act, and what they start doing to protest the Stamp Act is they start passing resolutions. They start groups like the Sons of Liberty, which today, believe it or not, would be deemed a terrorist organization. But as I've said in the past, one country's heroes are another country's terrorists. People like Sam Adams start these organizations. John Adams, Paul Revere, they get involved, and they basically start causing chaos. They start riots. They destroy ships. They let me fix this word when I'm looking at it. They do all these things to try to derail the government in the colonies, the British government in the colonies, and they do a pretty good job of it. In New York, they meet a thing called the Stamp Act Congress, and they actually claim that no assembly can tax them unless it's their own assembly in a state. So they're making some pretty bold claims, basically saying that Great Britain doesn't rule over them as much as Great Britain likes to think that they do. They boycott British goods, merchants sign non-importation agreements. Pretty much it gets so bad for British businesses in the colonies that they beg Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, which they do. But in response to repealing the Stamp Act, they pass what is called the Declaratory Act, which again, as we spoke about today, says that Parliament has the right to make all decisions for the colonies in all cases. So what Parliament is basically saying is we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but we're going to also pass this law that now says we have the right to pass any law or tax we want in any case regarding the colonies, kind of cementing the idea that we control the colonies. And again, it's about control. They're not upset because of the money. They're upset because of the tax, or the control, rather, that Britain is trying to kind of restrict them with. Again, I use the example of, imagine if you were a kid, you did whatever you wanted all your life, and then one day your parents kind of said to you, hey, you know what, you're going to start doing this chores, you're going to have to start paying rent, have to start being a good kid. You'd probably be a little bit upset too, but a little bit of a shock, just like it was to the colonies, and that's kind of where they're coming from right now. This is just a political cartoon of the Stamp Act. That would be the Stamp Act and the tiny little cough, and that would be George Grenville right there, which again is this guy over here. What they're basically trying to say is that Britain is in despair. It's like a funeral for the Stamp Act. It wouldn't be a good thing that it says the coffin is carried by George Grenville, was followed by Bute, the Duke of Bedford, Temple, Halifax, Sandwich, and 2 bishops. So they're basically holding a funeral for the repeal of the Stamp Act because they're just trying to show that it's a big event in the colonies that they're repealing the Stamp Act, and Britain's kind of embarrassed by it. And, you could tell because they're all kind of in mourning. My favorite thing right here is the dog that is peeing on the leader of the pack, saying, this would be kind of the colony saying kind of good riddance to what's happening. It's just kind of an interesting cartoon, interesting take on it. And then lastly, the Townshend Acts. This is passed in 1767, and it taxed only imported goods. So once again, it wasn't a direct tax on the colonies. Instead, it was taxed at the port of entry, and it would just be factored into the price. But unfortunately for Great Britain, at this point, the colonists were so angry that anything they did kind of ticked them off regardless. Okay, they could have passed a tax that was 1 penny. Or they could have made a law that made it substantially better, exponentially better for the colonists. But at this point, anything that Great Britain did that even resembled a passage of a law or some kind of control over them upset them. So they continued to boycott the British goods. And a group called the Daughters of Liberty, the book says some groups named, but many times there were groups called the Daughters of Liberty. These were like the wives of people in the Sons of Liberty and patriotic women. Women did do their part. They urged people to make homespun fabrics. They urged people to drink American tea and eat American foods and things like that. And they tried to also do their part as opposed to buying British goods. Because, again, the idea was you did not want to support the British government in any way. The American goods, you wouldn't have to pay these taxes on. The imported goods and the British goods, you'd be paying money directly to the government, and they did not want that. All right, so I've got about a minute left before time runs out. I want to keep this under 15 minutes. It's at 14 right now. So I want you guys to copy this down, get these notes into your notebooks. Make sure that you get pretty well versed in them. It's all pretty straightforward. One thing I would say is be familiar with the actual acts and the actions that the British government took against the colonies. Be familiar with the colonist reaction, kind of what you're getting done in your foldables for class. And that's really it. So if you have any questions, you can ask me tomorrow when you see me, and everybody's all good. So if you have a great night, and hopefully you enjoyed the lesson. Thank you.